So I'd like to welcome everybody to the data collection webinar series. And today's session is entitled Global Progress on Tracking Populations in Slums and Informal Settlements, Key Lessons and Data Challenges. My name is Archana Dwivedi, and I work with the Data Collection Unit at UNICEF New York headquarters. This series will be covering lots of topics that have recently gained relevance and importance, and where there's ongoing work on how to best collect data. Some housekeeping rules. We'll keep the mics muted for now, and we have about an hour and 15 minutes for the webinar. We'll see how many questions and answers there are, and kindly write your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to group them and have them answered towards the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the UNICEF SharePoint site together with past webinars. We will also post it on the Mix YouTube channel, so it'll be publicly available. You can find the links to both of these in the email that you were sent. So as I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is entitled Global Progress on Tracking Populations in Slums and Informal Settlements, Key Lessons and Data Challenges. We are very happy to have with us today Dennis Mwaniki. Apologies. Robert could not be with us today. Unfortunately, he was not feeling well. So we really appreciate Dennis joining us last minute to be part of this webinar. Just a little bit about Dennis. He is a special data expert at UN Habitat in the data and analytics section. He has day-to-day responsibilities include coordinating activities around geospatial data production, methodological developments, and supporting countries and cities in the integration of Earth observations and geospatial information techniques into urban monitoring processes. He currently leads UN Habitat's global activities on production of data on 3 SDG 11 indicators, which are reliant on Earth observation and geospatial information. They are 11.3.1, 11.2.1, and 11.7.1. So I would like to stop there and hand the floor over to Dennis, and the floors are yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Archana, and I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
It's a pleasure for me to also be here. Last minute, just as you said, sitting in for Robert, might join us and say something at some point. He's feeling better. But in the meantime, I'm going to share my screen and run us through a short presentation. Not very short, but short enough for the discussions. Let me know.
Yes, we can see the screen. If you could just put it on presentation mode. Perfect, Dennis. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about what we've been doing and measuring the indicator on slums and informal, what we've learned, but also some of the engagements with the line of slums and children in slum issues, which is a really interesting partnership and a new area of collaboration. So for as a context for this discussion, within Sustainable Goal number 11 on sustainable cities and communities, target 11.1 is about ensuring that everyone has access to adequate, safe and affordable housing, as well as basic services and to upgrade slums. Within this target, we have one main indicator that looks at the proportion of urban population that is living in slums, for those who have inadequate housing. And my presentation is going to focus more on these three concepts, what slums mean, what informal settlements mean, but also what housing inadequacy means, as well as the methods that we use to measure these indicators and how different data sources and methodologies come at play in the implementation of this. Just as addition to the background is that one of the main findings we've had over the last 20 years or so when we started measuring the slum indicator is the worrying trend of the urban informalities and how many people, especially in the poorer countries, live in formal settlements. With today, about 1.1 billion people expected to be living in slums. And here, as we proceed, we'll see what these slums been, but also the different levels of deprivations and how we can act together to ensure that we enhance the quality of life among these urban populations. Slums, of course, present the highest level of deprivation and exclusion. And here it is where majority of the urban poor often live, as well as also important entry point for new urban migrants, especially those in a lot of the developing countries. So people migrating from the rural areas to the urban areas who many times tend to end up in these kinds of settlements, which face different types of deprivations. And addressing, if we want to address the issue of attainment of sustainable development where no one and no place is left behind, then this is a very important entry area where a lot of actions can be undertaken, as well as one of the many places where would significantly make an impact if we to address the issues of poverty, deprivation, but also addressing the needs of majority of the urban poor who live in these kinds of settlements. One important thing to distinguish here before we even go to the details of the slums, which present themselves in different ways across countries and cities, is that our method defines household level deprivations, and sometimes you will have a person who lives in a household that we classify as having inadequacy based on the different criteria, but does not necessarily mean that that kind of household is located within a slum settlement. So here to distinguish specifically that we have settlement level measurement, but also a very specific household level sort of deprivations. So the cycle of depressions and issues that we can use to identify slums and informalities, as well as multiple deprivations. There are a lot of components that form this. And of course, the main one is the type of place where people live, whether they have access to basic services, such as water, sanitation, as well as things like whether they have security of tenure, but there are also many connections to the types of income that are associated with these, as well as the planning frameworks or what kind of organization is prevalent in this kind of settlements. Here, from our method, we identify several factors, about 7 factors that we use to define what a slum household is, and in turn, that can build into a settlement sort of definition. And the key ones here is the issue of the adequacy of water and sanitation, issues to do with the security of tenure, issue to do with the living environment, as well as the overall living environment in these places. For the data we have that we've been collecting since 2000 as part initially of the Millennium Development 7D that focus on the slums, we've seen an overall decline in the proportion of population living in slums, but the actual number of people has actually also risen. So as cities become more homes for more people across the world, yes, we've seen a proportional decline, but the numbers of people moving to cities has also increased. So in absolute numbers, we've actually seen a lot of population living these kinds of settlements. We have about 2.4 billion people who live without improved sanitation, as well as more than 2 billion people who have water stress. And another thing we found out is that female and children-headed households are often most vulnerable and usually have higher levels of inadequacies in housing as compared to male-headed households. So here is also an issue related to homelessness, which is another important measurement in complement to the measurement for the slum indicator. So to the now more measurement related issues, as I mentioned, we have three components of the slum indicator, the 11.1.1, the SDG. We have a definition for what we call the slum, for informal settlement and for inadequate housing. And across these three, there are quite a number of common issues. And this specifically relates to deprivations in the basic services, because a direct way to see slums and informalities is whether people in those places have basic services available to them, as well as the quality of the housing in which they live in. So here we make considerations for things like water, drinking water, improved sanitation, sufficiency of the living area, the quality of the housing, which we define based on the durability, issues on security of tenure, issues on the overall settlement typologies, and how organized or not organized these settlements are, as well as where these houses are located or where these settlements are located and how easily accessible they are. So just to distinguish these different criteria for the measurement of the slum and informal settlements, we use five main things. One is access to water, access to sanitation, the sufficient living area, overcrowding, the structural durability, and the location and security of tenure. Here, what we do for this is we look at a single household and determine whether the household, for example, has access to improved water and sanitation, and whether what kind of the structure that they live in is, and whether they have security of tenure. And these two we combine in the current data we produce. We combine issues of slums and informal settlements, but the goal is to separate these two and look at settlements more as a neighborhood level kind of analysis as opposed to household level deprivation. So in the current data that I was showing, about 1.1 billion people living in slums, this is actually based on the analysis of households where people don't have improved water sanitation, where the structural quality and the location or security of tenure is lacking. A second important thing is on the aspect of the inadequacy of housing. As you can see from this table, we really wish to measure all these the same sort of indicators, but due to data limitations, we picked one item, and this is based on global consultations with the stakeholders and experts, who identified that to distinguish between the issues of slum and informal settlement households, we could use affordability as the main indicator for measuring housing inadequacy. Here, housing affordability, we measure it by saying if a household is paying more than 30% of their gross income, then that household is considered to have housing inadequacy. However, long term, what would wish to be also able to integrate into these issues to do with the accessibility of the household, whether people can actually access their houses without difficulties, as well as issues to do with cultural adequacy. For example, in the area of building materials, a structure that is culturally accepted in one context, in this case, for example, in Asia, might not be the same as a household that is built using the same materials, say, in the Americas. So here we are making important considerations to look at the structure from also what the local context represent, and what that can actually add value in the separation of the adequacy of housing. So for these things that I've mentioned, as I mentioned, for the slums and informal settlements, we combine the different deprivations and say If a household has 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 deprivations, then they have very high levels of severity of household level deprivations and have a worse representation of the informality. The same, we split also them into individual deprivation, so we can see what proportion of the city or urban area people have access to, or they are lacking one deprivation, those which are lacking all 5 deprivation. Again, here we wish to have data for the 5, but some of the indicators here, the data inputs is always not very available. So in most cases, we are often using 4 deprivations to measure this indicator. Just a quick summary of what all these things mean. Starting off with the security of tenure, of course, here we consider 2 things. One is a formal document on either the land or the residence. This could be a title deed, the certificate, or other forms of locally recognized ownership documents. But we also consider things to do with the documentation for proof of tenancy. So if you have an agreement to live in a house for a certain period and you don't have like a lease agreement, then that makes you susceptible to being evicted, leased by your landlord, in this case, if someone is renting the property. So we consider then security of tenure as these 2 important components. Improved water and improved sanitation, we actually use the definitions under the JMP, and we look at the different components of the improved basic service that looks at contamination of water sources from fecal matter and other attributes. So here we consider the classifications of piped water into dwelling, public tap, people not working more than or rather the water tap not serving more than 5 households, issues, aspects on the protected spring and other sorts of water sources that are categorized as improved. The same for sanitation. We consider the protection from different exposures. In this case, consider elements on households that have access to public sewer, septic tank, flush toilet, VIP toilet, latrines, and other associated. Interestingly, on the structural issues of the household, we'll look at the location of the houses, whether they're located in hazardous places, or whether the materials that are used to construct that house are durable. Again, here I want to just emphasize the issue of course, the local context, because some materials that might be culturally or durable in one context would vary. So we look at the provisions in the building codes and standards that exist within each of these countries where we're measuring the performance. Then the last one on the sufficient living area or the indicator of overcrowding, we consider a household to be crowded if more than 3 persons live in a room. That is about 4 square meters in area. Because of course, if you have a bigger room and 3 people living in, then it doesn't mean that you'll be living in overcrowded situations. So we consider this as the official definitions for the different sorts of deprivations at the household level. Here, just to show that the physical manifestation of slums and households would ideally be very different. One would be where maybe you have disorganization or high levels of, say, density of houses, and in other places you'll have informality that manifests in either land ownership structures or the spatial organization of the settlement, which ideally both could constitute to what we call the slums and informal settlement. So I mentioned that the housing component, that is the 3rd component of this indicator 11.1.1, we use the affordability measure, and a house is considered to be unaffordable if you pay more than 30% of the total net income at the household level. The data sources, Mix, of course, is a very important data source. We use DHS. What we've seen is the most, of course, important data source here is the housing population and housing censuses, because they allow us to go deep down to disaggregate data to the highest level possible. Currently, we've been supporting countries to actually measure this indicator for specific cities and urban areas where they use the geocoded data from their census to an analysis on the harmonized definition for cities and urban areas to see how performances are for big cities, but smaller cities. And we can further disaggregate this into different sort of population attributes. Again, in cases where either the population census is not up to date or is old, we use the DHS and mix surveys data to also update this information and at least ensure that continuous data is being produced at the national level, with mostly with disaggregations done at the urban and rural units. Sampling structures that these data sources use, but we also use other data sources such as the living standards, household expenditure and income surveys, as well as other relevant surveys. And this is mostly excuse me, is mostly a sort of statistical analysis based on the deprivations at the household level. So summarize, we produce data for all the deprivations combined. So when you have all these combined, we have the slum indicator that says if you have one short up deprivation and 2 and 3 and 4, then you are slum household. And I want to just emphasize that these are mutually exclusive classes. So one shelter deprivations would be when a house has only one component but misses the 3. This 2 shelter deprivation is you only have 2 and don't have the other 2. And 3, it's where you have only one deprivation and do not have the rest. Here we're using 3 in this analysis because we data for some of the indicators, especially the security of tenure in most cases, is not always very available across. But where all these elements, 5 elements are available, then we also include the 5 shorter deprivations. So ideally, a household that has 4 deprivations or 5 deprivation is much more severely impacted by different basic service deprivations as opposed to one that only has 1 deprivation. And in that case, if a city or someone wants to intervene, then they'd be the first entry point would be intervene where there are more shelter deprivations than when you only have 1 deprivation. This also means that you can have a household that is has a deprivation in, say, a non-slum settlement. You could have a middle-income neighborhood or even a high-income neighborhood where the household does not have water, for example. And that household is considered to have the necessary deprivation, and then action for them that should be undertaken that is similar to a household that is located in a more informal settlement to provide for that specific service like water in this case. So here just summarizes that at the end, we have a value that integrate the different deprivations, but the data still be available to see which of the 4 or 5 deprivations are more severe or are most common in the specific area of interest. So to move a bit into our process of data collection, the official method that we follow is that we rely on data coming in from the national statistical systems. So we ask countries to submit data to us using a template that I will show in the next slide. And in many cases, if it's not, these countries would come to us to ask us to clarify maybe what attributes are needed or how to measure these datasets. Then we work with them to explain these methods, but also to provide some of the scripts that they would need to to make available this data. Once this data comes to us, we also cross-check it against other previous records that we have, and many of them which countries also provide. And where there's inconsistencies with the data, then we always have discussions with them to try and clarify. In processes where data is not coming directly from the countries, where they are unable to produce this data using surveys like DHS and MIX, we also help them to produce this, but we also do our own estimates based on the different criteria to determine the levels of access or deprivation against the different attributes. And this usually feeds into the urban indicators database that should be is openly available and accessible to everyone. And this data again goes back to the countries for them to validate and see whether it represents the actual situations on the ground. Here just to show the template that we send to countries to submit data for this indicator. So we look at the different deprivations, as I mentioned, so they can provide the values of the deprivations, either 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, based and also include what data sources they are using, as well as other gaps. So the idea for this is to have this data produced at the city level or urban area level, and also have this as a national value for the total urban performance for that specific country. So here points to the need for harmonization as to how we define cities and urban areas. And I know one of the subsequent discussions in this series is about the harmonized definition of cities and urban areas. So we are using this harmonized definition to help countries to also produce data that is using the same unit of measurement, so that you don't have one data point coming for a metropolitan area and another data point coming for a secondary city, and then one shows a very high level of deprivation against another area, yet the units of measurements are ideally not the same. So usually every year we send these templates to countries to populate and share their results for the indicator. So to just to show some summary on where we are, as I mentioned, we've seen a slight, a consistent rather decline in the proportion of urban population living in slums since 2000, from 30.8% to about 25%. You realize a slight increase between 2018 and 2020 in the share of population. This is occasioned by both a change in how we measure. We included some of the variables between 2018 and 2020, but also a slight increase in shares of population living in slums and informal settlement, especially for the developing regions, which were not always producing data for in previous cycles. Overall, most of the regions recorded a decline, other than Sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern and Southeastern Asia, or rather, yes, in the number of shares of population living in slums. In terms of actual numbers, I mentioned that we've recorded a consistent increase. So while we recorded a proportional decline in the proportion of population living in slums, the actual numbers have actually been increasing, of course, pointing to more people going into cities and people moving into these sort of settlements that categorized as informal. So this it's also cross-cutting and looks in different regions. It's more or less the trend has been consistent in most of the regions. And here just compares the two things, the share of slum population, but also the actual numbers. And we've seen a more increase in the numbers in Central and Southern Asia, as well as in the Sub-Saharan Africa, and also Oceania, which in this case includes New Zealand. In Western Asia and Northern Africa, we noted a decline over the years 2000 through to 2016, but then there's been a new trend where the numbers have also started to increase over the years, and the percentages also are starting to slightly increase in this specific region. So basically, that is it for the overall performances indicator. And here I just want to highlight the work that we've been doing over the last year with 2 years with UNICEF. We've been trying to work towards more looking at the slum performance for children and to track how many children live in slums, but also the trends in the proportion of children living in slums based on the same sort of deprivation that I mentioned previously. So looking at households that are classified as slums or informal settlements, and based on that, how many children aged between 0 and 17, 5 and 17 that live in these sort of households. So we've also produced data for different indicators based on this classification. So looking at things like health indicators such as malnutrition, diarrhea, malaria, children, labor, and so on and so forth. And we're looking this data, we produce it for 3 time periods between 1990 and 2020. And the disaggregations are at the urban level between urban and rural, slums and non-slum households, but also different types of urban settlements. So currently we've covered about 100 countries based on the different surveys that are available, and specifically from GHS mix, but also from censuses that are coming from countries. Here, just to quickly show some of the numbers that we been able to get, and this one is the number of children living in slum households by the total urban population living in slums, and you can see for many of these countries the performances. Ideally, of course, the share of children living in slum household is also proportionate to the total number of population living in slum households at large. And this data is available and for colleagues to also explore and see if there's added value. So finally, just to highlight 3 main challenges that we still face in measurement of this indicator. One, and perhaps the most important one, is that many countries do not collect data that is disaggregated formally based on formal or informal settlements or slum non-slum areas. So, and that is where you see we still rely a lot on the classification of households based on the different deprivations. One of the things we've been discussing with countries is how to adopt these classifications and be able to consistently produce data that not only shows the deprivations, but also more characteristics of the slum settlements at large. And based on this lack of this sort of classifications, one thing we've noted is that a lot of slum population do not get measured. For example, there are countries that have really big slums. I don't want to mention any name, but they consider themselves to not have any slums. So this creates a bit of a challenge, even when we use the deprivation-based analysis to estimate their proportions of population in these kinds of households, then the numbers are often quite disputed because there's no national definition. Now, of course, we have a lot of data gaps also, especially related to the element on the security of tenure, which is not, again, collected in either at the national level during the censuses, but also during the surveys that a lot of countries conduct. So the push from our side here has been to ask countries to include a question to measure security of tenure in most of their surveys. And the good thing is that quite a number of countries have actually been picking this up based on the new joint methodology developed between UN Habitat, World Bank, and FAO to look at issues that measure security of tenure at the local level. And of course, the overall data processing capacities of countries where the traditional ways of analyzing analyzing data, have not fully integrated the measurement of the different aspects of measurement for slums and informal settlements. But again, here we're making very good progress, and we've been directly supporting more countries to really adopt these practices of disaggregating their data based on these different types of settlement. I'll stop here and just say that one of the key things we are doing, and that is hopefully we hope by next year will be out for global rollout, is we've been developing a global model that is based on Earth observation geospatial analysis to be able to classify settlements that are informal, which then would complement the analysis that we're doing based on the household level deprivation. So what you can expect to see in the next maybe 2-3 years is more analysis based on city level analysis that shows what slum or informal settlements from a much more area-based perspective look like, and that will definitely complement the data we have on the slums and informal settlement. So I'll stop here and stand back over to you.
Thank you so much, Dennis, for a very comprehensive overview of the work that you do, the very important work that you do in terms of collecting data on slums. So I invite people to provide some questions in the chat. And while people are doing that, I see already one from Rolf. So he's asking, do I understand it correctly that with the method presented, you can estimate the proportion and number of people living in slums, but not indicate which areas can be considered slums and which can't, or where these people are living, and that UN Habitat uses other data to classify areas as informal, etc.
Yes, thanks for that question, Rolf. Yes, indeed, we use the deprivations to produce or to analyze data on the slums populations. Yet we don't yet actually have an area-based method that is globally applicable, and I will tell you why. Is because the settlement of the slum is very diverse across countries. Even in the same city, the manifestation of a slum would be very difficult to harmonize and say this is a slum, because in one place might be there's no security of tenure, so you need data on security of tenure for that context. In another place, the densities will be very high, then you need a different sort of analysis. In another place, water and sanitation is missing, where the neighborhood might look quite well planned. So these have actually been the big challenge in the past. But this is what I mentioned, that the current model that we've been working on actually helps us to move beyond just looking at the deprivations at the household level and start to look at the settlement level or the area-based analysis of how these settlements manifest and where they are located in the city. So this broadly, I'd say, is the response on this.
Thank you, Dennis. Boris is asking, could we possibly have access, or where can we get access to the country data?
Yes, the data is available in our website, data.unhabitat.org, under the housing tab. And if you don't find what you need there, you can always write to us, and we'll provide that data, including the data for children and slums that I think should be available to UNICEF colleagues.
Wonderful. So just to pick up on your last comment on the children and slums, which of course for UNICEF is very interesting. So when you talked about the challenges, are there any specific challenges around that particular data that you collect?
Yes, it's again most based on the resolution of data that is available, and in particular on the sampling structures, because in most cases the census data, which has the highest resolution, is not consistently available. Every 10 years, in our view, is too long to be able to analyze data at the city scale. So while we've been trying to really see these performances at the city level, having data, say, for example, from Mix and DHS that only looks at urban and rural, it really doesn't help us to see the kind of the disaggregated or depth of analysis that would really be valuable for action. So for example, for UNICEF, I know that you're also interested in acting in very specific context. So perhaps providing you data say that 40% of children, urban children in a country live in slum doesn't have the same weight as telling you 60% of populated children in, say, Mumbai or in Nairobi live in slums. Then the value here is really that added level of detail of the data. So for us, this is one of the biggest challenge, and one thing that would definitely be really keen to also explore further in details.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I see Andreas has a question. Have you had a chance to look at the correlation with other deprivations, such as access to health services, immunizations, things like that?
Yes, actually, one of the discussion we did with Attila was the numbers we are getting actually from the children in slums with the levels of immunization. And we actually have done something very small in this area. We've not analyzed this in the entire context. However, the data we provided, I can tell you right now, all the indicators. So the indicators we're producing for this the children in slums basically looks at things to do with the maternal health, so antenatal care, delivery care, child nutrition, malnutrition, breastfeeding, vaccination, diarrhea, pneumonia, malaria, ITNS, child protection issues, birth registration, child labor, marriage, violence, but also attendance to school for these different categories. So I will not say that we have done any report or anything related to say that this is performance, but the data we've been able to produce the data for the shares of children in slums again as also these sort of other indicators.
Okay, thank you. Eric asks why you didn't increase the work with UNICEF Mix team to improve the inclusion of your indicators and mixed questionnaires. In other hand, why did you try to work with mixed team or DHS team to oversample the urban area of these surveys to have more data in council and urban areas? Yeah.
That's a very interesting question by Eric, and the response to that is actually this the discussion that we're having with UNICEF, and this is the direction we want to go. I could answer also this from a country perspective. We've in many cases we've been asking also countries to consider in the other service this sort of questions that are relevant. But there's always the challenge of the increase in the number of questions that come with the much more loaded questionnaire and what that also implies in terms of the investments for those contexts. But definitely, this is the discussion that UNICEF and UN Habitat have been having at a higher level to really see how this kind of information complement and under the auspices of our upcoming joint project on the city definition, harmonized city definition. This is also one of the key pillars, one of the things that is also very much interest to that discussion.
Okay. I'm just waiting to see if there's any other questions in the chat. All right. Well, Dennis, I really appreciate very literally last minute filling in and doing such a wonderful job of giving us an overview of your work and the work that you're continuing to do with UNICEF on the children's aspect. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And also thank everyone else for your participation and your comments and questions. I'd like to remind everybody that the next webinar will take place in 2 weeks at the same time. And the webinar is entitled, What Drives Vaccine Uptake? Gathering and Using Data to Address Behavioral and Social Drivers of Vaccination. So we hope you can join us then. Just a reminder that the presentations and recordings will be available on the UNICEF SharePoint site, and it will also be available on the Mix YouTube channel for the public. So thank you again very much, Dennis, and thank you everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you in a couple of weeks. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Atan.